Brad Potter. Brad is the science coordinator for the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes LCC, and at this time he's doing two jobs because he's also kind of the acting coordinator while John Rogner is doing some other things with Kankakee Refuge. So Brad's going to give the presentation today, and with that, Brad, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Rick. And before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Rick for asking me to participate in today's webinar. These opportunities to connect across the LCC geographies, I think, are a strength of the LCC network. And the interaction that I'm going to have with you today, I hope will be useful to you as you continue to move forward in the Plains and Prairie Potholes LCC. I know for sure that your questions and thoughts, comments will be helpful to me as we advance our work in the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover a little bit about the evolution and progress in the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes LCC and describe our path toward a collaborative landscape conservation approach. But before I do, just a little bit of a personal introduction. As Rick just stated, and perhaps you saw in the bio, science coordinator for the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes LCC, serving in an acting role as the LCC coordinator. Prior to working with the LCC, I was a biologist for the Upper Mississippi River and Great Lakes Region Joint Venture, doing mostly GIS work and species habitat modeling and planning. I'm stationed in the East Lansing field office in Michigan, but I spend most of my free time on Michigan's west coast near the Ludington area doing all things outdoors. So with that intro, let's get to it. So we all know this. The world is changing. We've got more people. We're packing it on the landscape. We're approaching 10 billion, or approach 10 billion by 2050, based on some projections. We're seeing an accelerated land use change. There's no better example than the Bakken oil field that's happening in your geography. We've got rapidly changing global climate. We have greater technologies for communications and connecting people with ideas. All this is resulting in accelerated change both in the ecological and social context in which we take our conservation actions. The National Academy of Sciences recognize this as much in their review of the LCC network. They state in the past, environmental threats were perceived as local. However, many threats to natural resources occur at much larger spatial scales. Ecosystem degradation is occurring at an unprecedented rate. It's clear that the most significant conservation challenges facing the United States today transcend administrative and geopolitical boundaries. So these challenges cross jurisdictions, ecological systems, and conservation priorities. In that way, they exceed the responsibility of any single conservation agency or program. Their complexity requires a multiple disciplinary and sector approach as the problems and solutions go beyond just ecological. So we have a way to respond to these challenges through a landscape conservation approach. It's all about being strategic. How do we make wise investments towards specific conservation outcomes while anticipating and reducing risk from ecological and social changes? This approach will take the collective capacity of the conservation community and others. Just like I stated before, these challenges cross jurisdictions, and it's going to take many working together to tackle them. Over the last 6 years, the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes LCC has been honing in on a landscape conservation approach that works for the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes geography. This approach is built on a foundation of collaboration, communication, and information management. It supports the identification of shared challenges and priorities, uses evidence and science to plan and identify priority locations for conservation action, leading to strategy development. And those strategies are implemented, and we monitor our progress, always striving to learn and adjust and improve. So before I delve too deeply into that framework and our application, I'd like to give you a sense of how we got to this approach. I'll start by covering the history and the evolution of the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes LCC, go into greater detail on our strategic plan and our approach, and then finally I'll show some examples from our efforts in aquatic connectivity and coastal wetland conservation. In the early years, we started like many LCCs. We focused on landscape conservation science, particularly with the emphasis on climate change science. In 2010, we formed our steering and technical committee. We funded our first round of projects. This was via financial resources provided to us by the Environmental Protection Agency through the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. At this time, the LCC had an acting coordinator and science coordinator. Moving to 2011, the LCC expanded its capacity. The coordinator and science coordinator were hired. Steering committee retreat began refining our purpose, but the activities and our energy were still continue with identifying and supporting landscape conservation science. By 2012, we had finalized a vision and mission statement. We continued our ongoing science work, but it was at this point where we took a pause and conducted a high-level shared priorities assessment, an attempt to become more focused. And then in 2013, we used the results of that shared priorities assessment, identified some focus areas, and then our project proposals became much more specific. We established some focus area working groups as part of the LCC structure. So I refer to these early years as the era of science production for the LCC. And although we really focused on generating new science during this period, we did improve our focus and created an LCC vision statement. The vision statement that was developed during this time was a conservation community that, while governed by their unique purposes and missions, collaborates on sustaining lands and waters that support natural and cultural resources and services they provide. The final year in this era was really a major transition year. We began to ask ourselves, are our operations of investing in new and more science really moving us forward towards that vision? Are we really working towards collaboration that sustains land and waters that support natural resources? And the answer simply was no. We needed a more holistic approach, one that helped us define our goals, brought together our best people, looked at existing and new science in different ways, and used technology to assist in the process. We really needed to improve our path toward our vision. Since 2014, we've been refining that more holistic approach. The focus area work groups were formed and began the process of stepping down those high-level priorities to more specifics. For example, the coastal work group identified working on coastal wetlands and their associated ecological and human services as the top priority within that landscape. It's also at this time we start to see the terms of shared goals and landscape conservation design become more prominent in our dialogue and our project work. We also have a shift from using our resources for strictly supporting project work to convening people around the idea of landscape conservation in each of those focal areas, coordinating a variety of teams and efforts, and compiling and synthesizing existing information. By 2015, we took an additional step with our aquatic connectivity focus area and formed a chartered collaborative. This formally recognizing the need for a concerted regional effort to address the issue. And our coastal conservation work group also started up a landscape conservation design process for coastal wetland conservation. We drafted a new LCC strategic plan, and it was really over these last 2 years that we committed to a collaborative landscape conservation. And over the last year, we've articulated our approach and formally adopted it in an LCC strategic plan. Which leads me to the strategic plan and our landscape conservation approach. The language that I'm going to show you is from our strategic plan, it's from our draft. We have agreed to the ideas and the approach, but we're still cleaning it up and clarifying the language a little bit. It should be final in the next couple of months, so you may see some inconsistencies or errors. But overall, this is what's been approved and how we're moving forward. So starting out, we decided to drop our vision and mission statement and just form one single identity statement. This statement says that we're a community dedicated to collaborative approach to landscape conservation. Specifically, it talks about the composition of agencies and organizations and how that they're unique, but that we're coming together to align our actions around ecological challenges that transcend jurisdictional boundaries. It states how that we're ultimately here to sustain ecological functions and services, and it also generally describes our process. We We've formed our objectives and our strategic plan around 2 questions. Actually, I guess it's 3 if you break the first one into its 2 component parts. Specifically, the plan is there to address the questions of what natural resource conservation challenges do we share that require a collaborative conservation approach? What strategies are there to attain our goals? And how do we work more efficiently and effectively to pursue landscapes that sustain natural resources at desired levels? We also formulated a strategic objective. This is a statement of what we're ultimately after. We're looking to maximize the number of natural resource priorities at desired levels across the upper Midwest and Great Lakes. This is classified as a strategic objective because it's fundamental to everything that we do organizationally. In a sense, it helps keep us grounded and it keeps us focused. But we also do not have complete control towards attaining this objective. There's other outside influences and actors that we can't control. But what we do control is what we can deliver organizationally. In this case, we can collaboratively devise and implement conservation strategies, and we can work towards maintaining a high-functioning organization. That second objective there is really an acknowledgement that our efforts go beyond the ecological challenges, but also that we're looking to do conservation in a new way in this geography. How we do this is through our landscape conservation approach. It's represented by this wheel with 2 circles here. Starting with the outer circle at the top, this element describes that we need to identify our challenges and priorities and then develop a conservation community around those challenges and priorities. Moving over to the right, we have biological planning and landscape design. This is the place where we start to put science into practice. We also in this element, we identify our specific priority resources and concerns, establish goals, and pull together our best knowledge and evidence base around those priorities. Pulling all that information together leads us to conservation strategy development. Based on our goals and objectives, we then chart a landscape vision and ask ourselves, what is our strategy to attain that vision? The LCC participants and others, either individually or through partnerships, then implement and voluntarily take action based on the strategies. And in the last element, we evaluate and monitor progress, informing adjustments in our goals, strategies, and actions. All of this effort is supported by the inner ring. We acknowledge that to do this well, we must focus on building trust, to have successful collaboration, that good and effective communications is necessary to facilitate the process, that we must put our information into context around the priorities and goals and share them broadly. Investing time and resources into these areas are essential to the process. I'd like to talk a little bit about how we're applying this in 2 of our focus areas. So I'm going to describe our efforts in aquatic habitat connectivity and coastal wetland conservation. Starting with aquatic habitat connectivity, I think we all recognize the challenges that aquatic barriers pose on aquatic systems. Dams and poorly designed culverts and road stream crossings block the movement of aquatic species. They trap sediment, increase water temperatures, and overall have pretty detrimental effects on species population. One may believe that the simple solution is just to remove all barriers when the possibility arises, but this is a complex issue. Barriers in the Great Lakes region are both harmful and helpful. For example, they're damaging to our native species like northern pike that have to move up the tributaries to access wetland areas to spawn. But they're also helpful in a way that they help control the spread of sea lamprey, an aquatic invasive that costs us $20 million annually to control in the Great Lakes for the purpose of trying to protect the multi-billion-dollar Great Lakes fishery. And this issue is across landscapes. In the Great Lakes Basin, there's nearly 275,000 possible barriers. All those blue dots on that map there are road stream intersections. And through some recent work, we've now condensed the 275,000 down to about 105,000 that we believe have consequences directly for Great Lakes aquatic organisms. So what is our approach, or what are the activities that we're taking within this landscape conservation approach? I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the formation of the Aquatic Habitat Connectivity Collaborative, which relates to that top element there. We'll talk about some landscape assessment and decision support tools that fit in the biological planning and landscape design element. I'm going to talk about the platform that we're using to manage and disseminate information around the issue. The formation of the Aquatic Habitat Connectivity Collaborative, our steering committee led the development of a charter for this collaborative. This charter, in it, it states a vision for a connected Great Lakes and their tributaries to increase or maintain population levels of a genetic diversity of desired aquatic species, allow bidirectional movement of energy and nutrients by fish, prevent unacceptable increases of detrimental species, and meet economic and social objectives. The collaborative is going to do this by establishing aquatic habitat connectivity targets, support progress and actions towards those targets, promote and develop strategies for restoring aquatic connectivity, and stimulating research and knowledge for improved decision making. This collaborative has broad representation from the conservation community and others all working together on this process. The effort is led by a strategic coordinator position that is cost shared by participating organizations on the LCC. This includes the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. Some of our LCC-based funding goes to it as well, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. We also have a co-coordinator for the effort that provides some technical assistance that's provided by the Fish and Wildlife Service. We also have some tools that help us with our decisions. Some of these tools were developed using base LCC funding, but others of them have been brought forward to the collaborative by participating organizations. This suite of tools allows us to look at the connectivity problem across the Great Lakes Basin in a way that we've never been able to do before. The tool on the top left we call FishWorks. FishWorks is based on an optimization model that identifies a portfolio of projects in a given geography based on a given budget that maximizes stream miles reconnected for the benefits to priority species. The FishViz tool on the lower left predicts the impact of climate change on riverine habitat and associated fish species and fish assemblages. The sea lamprey control map identifies the existing barriers that are critical to managing sea lamprey and also helps look at the potential impacts that may occur if those blocking structures are removed. And then lastly, the Fish Habitat Decision Support Tool provides a variety of metrics around fish habitat condition in watersheds and stream reaches. These tools are already being put into practice and helping to make conservation decisions around the region, but they're really vital information as we convene the collaborative and discuss our priorities as we move forward. Also, I'd like to talk about our concerted effort to put our information around these issues into context and all into one place. The LCC supported the development of an information management and delivery system that was built exclusively around the adaptive management process. The system allows the user to locate information on data, on maps, decision tools, conservation goals, various projects, all related around a single conservation issue. It really helps the user see the connections between the information. They can see how their actions may contribute to regional goals, see what others are doing around the issue, and overall helping to really facilitate collaboration. And this is collaboration that can happen, a term that we use, independent collaboration, where you don't necessarily always have to be sitting in the same room with each other, but by facilitating what's going on, it helps individuals see how they can contribute to broader goals. And combined overall, these are just some examples of some of the investments that we're making to take on the landscape conservation approach for aquatic connectivity. I'm going to now shift gears a little bit and describe our efforts in coastal wetland conservation. Looking at the issue for Great Lakes coastal wetlands, there are some high-quality coastal wetlands remaining, but 2/3 of the original coastal wetlands have been converted for other uses. Unfortunately, much of this conversion occurred before we understood the multiple ecological and human values coastal wetlands provided. So we're applying our landscape conservation approach to identify and restore, help us identify and restore those lost values. Some of those activities that we have ongoing include a landscape conservation design process that includes the development of decision support tools, a region-wide monitoring program, and some upcoming implementation actions that are being guided by our work, and then also managing and disseminating our information around this issue as well. So I'll start with our landscape conservation design effort. The definition of landscape conservation design is an iterative, collaborative, and holistic process that provides information, analytical tools, spatially explicit data, and conservation strategies to achieve conservation goals among partners. For Great Lakes coastal wetlands, our effort is being led by the LCC's Coastal Conservation Work Group, which includes about 15 members, but it also reaches out and engages a much broader conservation community from other conservation organizations that aren't part of the work group to local community leaders through a series of workshops and other media. Some of the questions that we're addressing via this landscape conservation design process are for example, like what purposes does coastal wetland conservation target? What are our goals for those purposes? How many restored and protected acres are enough to attain our goals? Which wetlands or wetland system characteristics will maintain our benefits under a changing climate and landscape? How much will it cost to restore, protect, and enhance this wetland system? We're doing this effort in a subset of the Great Lakes Basin. We're focused in on an area that spans Saginaw Bay to western Lake Erie. For those not real familiar with the Great Lakes region, this kind of, if you look at the Great Lakes, this encapsulates all what we would call the thumb of the mitten in Michigan. The large geography that crosses two states has wetlands with both high existing ecological value but also high degradation. This area is also home to a lot of people. It really is the perfect geography to pilot a process that looks at achieving both ecological and human well-being goals. So some of the basic elements to our process include establishing targets and goals. This is really where we identify what species or system processes that we're collectively managing for. Identifying what human well-being targets coastal wetlands benefit. And then the next step is to gather some data around those targets, including pulling together existing information, but also filling information gaps. For example, we lack knowledge on the human well-being aspects of this effort, so we're investing in research to fill that gap. The next step is some data analysis and mapping, and all towards the eye to strategy development and implementation. Much like aquatic connectivity, we've already invested in some decision support tools to move our conversations forward. One of these tools displays data from a basin-wide Great Lakes coastal wetland monitoring program, allowing users to rank existing wetlands based on a series of user-defined filters. And complementing that tool is an assessment of potentially restorable wetland areas. So we have a continuum that brings us all the way from the condition of existing coastal wetlands to identifying those areas that are not currently coastal wetlands but could be put back into coastal wetland conditions via restoration. So these two tools together allow us to look at the landscape and start to really ask some questions about what our strategy would be to put coastal wetlands back on the landscape. We're going to be using these tools in the upcoming fiscal year to guide some Great Lakes Restoration Initiative funding towards some high-priority coastal wetland projects. This will include developing a multi-agency review team, and the process is going to be quite different from how projects have been identified in the past. This conversation and project identification process is being facilitated by LCC staff and LCC participants. So this is a really exciting and interesting step that we're taking here in the LCC, getting involved in in some of this conversation about implementation and using some of these, helping facilitate the use of some of these tools that we're providing. And lastly, we're using that same information platform as aquatic connectivity to place our information, data, maps, tools, projects, and goals into context around the issue of coastal wetland conservation. And so with that, I'm going to wrap this up with a few final words. Going back to the beginning of the presentation, we see conservation in the 21st century facing complex and rapid change. Responding to those changes is going to take multiple disciplines and sectors working together. In the Upper Midwest and Great Lakes LCC, we recognize that conserving natural resources across broad landscapes, really what our original and ultimate vision was, that we needed to do more than just science production alone. We needed to take a more holistic approach, a more holistic collaborative approach to our efforts. And that finally, the LCCs really provide a forum for developing this landscape conservation approach that works for the circumstances that occur within those geographies. So I know I just grazed across the top of many of these concepts and activities that we have going on. So I just wanted to give you guys a flavor of what we have doing in our evolutionary process in the Great Lakes LCC. But like I said, I know I just touched the edges of this stuff. So I wanted to be able to leave a considerable amount of time for any questions or comments or areas that you'd like me to delve into a little bit deeper. So with that, thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Brad. That was very well done. I really appreciate it. So let me open up the phone lines to anybody who has a question for Brad.
Hey, Brad. This is Max at Northern Prairie.
How's it going, Max?
Hey, not bad. Good presentation, by the way. I have a quick question for you, and I hope that you don't think that I'm asking you to air any dirty laundry here. But how difficult was it for you and John to get your LCC moving in this direction? And I guess a second part to that question would be, who was it who really did the work? I mean, how I guess I'm more interested sort of in the nuts and bolts of how you actually got this moving and who was responsible for doing what in terms of advancing this concept that you guys have started.
Yeah, so first off, it really was a collective effort, and a lot of stealing of good ideas from what others have done either in the past or are doing now, both other LCCs and other entities. When it comes to formulating the actual ideas and pitching them and putting them down on paper and for reaction, a lot of that work did fall on the hands of John Rogner and myself as coordinators of the LCC. We brought many of those ideas to the steering committee over a period of probably 3 steering committee meetings where we talked about the various, what we were doing at that time and how we could do things better, getting their feedback on what they would see as a better way forward and a better approach. And then it really materialized when we spent some time drafting that strategic plan. And we had a sub-team of steering committee members join John and I, and we put together the ideas in that strategic plan and brought it forward to the steering committee, went through a couple of revisions, but in the end, it was a good process to really get to where we are now. I would say that we're early on. We think we're on to what's a good approach that's going to work here, but we are just in the early phases of starting to implement that approach. So I imagine there's going to be some adjustments along the way. let me see, what else did you ask? You had about 3 questions in there, Max.
Well, it was just, yeah, I'm sorry. I was kind of formulating it as I was thinking. So, no, I think you basically answered it. I mean, I think that maybe one of the things that, you know, groups that don't necessarily start out organically often kind of maybe have a hard time advancing in a particular direction, and so thank you for your answer.
Yeah. Okay.
Anybody else have a question for Brad?
This is Jeff Nelson. I just have a kind of a follow-up to Max's question. I'm kind of curious as to how you engage those agencies, other partners who would be implementing the plan in the planning process itself. And it sounds like you have significant resources that are there to be deployed in terms of connectivity or coastal wetland conservation. I'm just curious as to how you engage them in the planning so that when the planning was done, there was buy-in and ownership in implementation.
Yeah, so we spend a lot of our time and our resources for this LCC now in convening, facilitating, having conversations and dialogue about really what's needed and reaching out to folks. So, for example, with the coastal wetlands process and the landscape conservation design there, like I said, it's being really led by a team of about 15 members on our coastal conservation work group. But we identified, or we spent a lot of time identifying who really should be there for the critical conversations about not the process, but what is needed, and what should be our targets, and what types of information are needed to move forward, and what types of tools, and who do they think they should be interacting with that they're not interacting with, and all sorts of questions for them. And we spent a lot of time at a couple of workshops asking those questions and getting feedback. We spent more time listening to those conservation community members than we did presenting information. But now what we got to do is we're in the process now of collating that and bringing that together and bringing it back out to them. And it's going to be this constant back and forth dialogue between bringing information forward to the community and hearing what they have to say about how useful that is. And I think as long as we do it well, and it's well planned and well thought out when we go into each of those engagements, and they find value in each of those engagements, they'll continue to participate in this conversation. Everything that we've heard so far in the process that we've taken, especially around coastal wetlands, we've just received really good positive feedback. When it comes to the aquatic connectivity issue, that has a similar outreach type effort to a broad conservation community, where we've brought together continual conversations, and it's this back and forth dialogue between those that implement and practice on the ground and those of us that are trying to take a look at a broader landscape and bring some different perspectives to the work that they do on the ground. Maybe I didn't.
No, that's good. I think that the lesson is that there has to be value in the minds of the implementers to sort of get engaged in a planning process. I'm kind of just one quick follow-up, and then I'll quit asking questions, is how did you go about interacting with probably pre-existing plans and efforts that were being implemented by the joint ventures that work in the same area, and how did you engage them in the planning process?
Yeah, so here's a perfect example. I'm going to go back to the coastal wetlands effort. The very first workshop that we convened with the coastal wetlands community was one of the questions we asked her, what are the plans that right now drive your coastal wetland conservation efforts? And I had anticipated that maybe there was a dozen plans maybe that would be referenced by folks to do coastal wetland conservation. Well, what we came out with was there's closer to 30 or 40 different plans that are out there that drive coastal wetland conservation. That, to me, says what we don't need is another plan, right? But what we do, what we can do is we can start a conversation about how the various activities that are being proposed in those plans and the objectives that are in those plans, how do they complement each other? Do some of them conflict each other? How do we bring all of this together perhaps in a more complementary or synchronized approach to taking coastal wetland conservation actions? And I think it's only by raising all of those different plans that are being referenced and looking across them to see where some of those conflicts and complementary approaches are, can we actually start to have a really good conversation about how do JV objectives relate to, say, fish habitat objectives and other objectives that, say, communities are trying to achieve in their restoration activities. The joint venture in this region is very actively engaged in that process. The science coordinator for that JV, the JV in this region, participates on our coastal wetland work group and is a very active participant on that work group, and actually really enjoys the opportunity to engage with a broader base than just bird habitat conservation, because he recognizes that coastal wetland conservation is not going to only be held up or rely upon bird habitat conservation, that it really is about what people need, what people want, and what other agencies are working towards when it comes to coastal wetland conservation. I think we've got a pretty good relationship there, and at least that's how we approach. We try not to think about it as developing another plan, but showing how some of these things relate to each other.
Other folks have questions?
Yeah, Rick, this is Neil Feakin with the Nature Conservancy, and Brad, appreciate your presentation today. It's been really interesting. Our LCC has spent a fair amount of time and effort and resources over the last several years kind of thinking about this concept of social change and human dimensions and what motivates particular landowners to take or to make one decision over another. And it seems like you guys have taken an approach to really kind of take a closer look at the ecological impacts that you're having, but maybe I'm mishearing that. Can you talk a little bit about how you've incorporated that human use needs into your planning and your thinking?
Yeah, we're really on the front end of that aspect for us. I'm going to go back to the coastal example. We spent a lot of time digging through the literature and information to try to identify human well-being targets for coastal wetland conservation, and there's just a lack of information out there. We know that wetlands provide a variety of services for people that we think they would probably take conservation action if they knew that wetlands perhaps were abating floods and providing some resiliency from water level fluctuations on the Great Lakes and other perhaps things that wetlands benefit humans, but there's just not a whole lot of information out there. So we spent some time with experts on this topic, some human dimensions experts, convened an expert panel, and put together a framework to try to start going out and investigating this issue or this data gap that we have around the human well-being values of coastal wetlands. And we're to the point now where this year we're going to fund a project that will help us better identify those values, hopefully identify where they exist on the landscape, and then in the long run, perhaps get us to what you guys are talking about in your region. What are the perceptions of various individuals and landowners, and what would it take to get them to change behavior or change action. But we really need to start with an assessment of what the values are that people would appreciate and where those values exist on the landscape and where we can put them back in, or at least that's where we're starting. I'm going to switch over to the aquatic connectivity issue. We have started conversations around aquatic connectivity and the issue of infrastructure resiliency. We've done this in conjunction with the North Atlantic LCC. We brought together some of the departments of transportation and emergency management sector to talk about how we have some mutual interest here around this issue of road-stream intersections. Typically, culverts and bridges and dams that cause problems for blocking aquatic connectivity also have some potential problems for infrastructure resiliency or potential for damage. For example, perched culverts are not only block fish, but have a greater probability of overtopping and blowing out. And so we started a conversation about how we can work together to start to identify those places where we can get both the ecological benefits and also some resiliency benefits to future storms and so on. Not directly related to the perceptions of human use and human values, but we're starting to try to figure out where that intersection lies with, we know that people value safe and sound infrastructure, so we're working right directly with the agencies that have the influence over those structures. Those are just a couple examples. I don't think we've gotten as far along in investing in that work as you guys have, and like I said earlier, I hope at some point Rick can return the favor and present perhaps some of the work that's going on in the PPP LCC, and maybe we can learn something from your efforts in working with landowners and people's perceptions.
Thanks, Brad. Anybody else have questions?
Hey, Brad, this is Dean Granholm. Nice presentation. I especially liked the piece there where you talked about sort of the era of science production and then sort of that you morphed into something else. And I guess this is just a general question to you, is that you know, you picked on those two topics, that aquatic connectivity and coastal wetlands. And I'm wondering not only if you could just sort of maybe go on a little bit about not only those being the priorities that emerge from the collaborative, but what value they've added to you know, increasing maybe the value of the collaborative to the people that are part of it.
So can you rephrase your question another way?
Yeah, let me. I guess, has it helped propel things forward by being able to identify a few things that you've been able to work on? I noticed the
Yes.
aquatic connectivity kind of cuts across the entire LCC, but the coastal wetlands thing seems to be more focused in there. And I'm just wondering, how has that added to the value of, you know, the whole thing?
Yep, got it. Yeah. So we did spend some time in this. If you're familiar with the Great Lakes region, we have a lot of partnership efforts already around the Great Lakes. Many partnership efforts. And so we had to spend some time filtering through the niche for this LCC and where we could really provide some value. And the surprising one was the aquatic connectivity effort was one of the very first efforts and focuses proposed to take on as this LCC, which was kind of a surprise to me because we have such a strong partnership base with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission. But it was the Great Lakes Fishery Commission that came to the table and said, hey, we have this issue of sea lamprey control and trying to do the best thing that we can to restore connections across the Great Lakes. And while we have convened and we bring together the Great Lakes fishery community, this issue is bigger than us. It's bigger than the fish community. Can we use the LCC venue to reach further, reach broader? And the immediate answer was yes. And so that having that request and having that focus really did start to energize the collaborative, because there was something now to grab onto. There's this problem out there that we can say, well, how are we going to solve it? And it really did energize the group. A lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue around those things. Same thing with all of our other focal landscapes and focal areas. With coastal, it was, yeah, we're spending, the question was, we're spending, how much money are we spending on coastal wetland conservation every single year? There's millions of dollars going out via the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and other conservation actions for coastal wetlands. Well, what are we getting out of those investments, and can we better place those investments? And so folks really energized around that idea as well. We have the two topics, or the other topics I didn't talk about, is our urban focus area, which is shared with the Eastern Tallgrass Prairie and Big Rivers LCC. That's really starting to move forward as well. And we have some focus on forest conservation and forest landscapes. And it really is having these focal landscapes and focal topics that allow the conversation to zoom in and say, how is it? What is it that we're trying to do, and how is it that we're going to get there? And without that, I think we would have really stayed in this mode of, well, we're here to just produce landscape scale science. That wasn't fulfilling enough, at least for our steering committee or for the organizations sitting around that table. They really wanted to solve some problems.
Great,
Thanks, Brad. It's 10 minutes to 3, folks. Any other questions for Brad? We still have 10 minutes we can use if we want to.
Rick, this is Jeff again. I have one other follow-up. One of the things that the PPP shares with the Great Lakes LCC is a significant part of the landscape we're interested in is in Canada. I'm wondering what your experience has been in engaging the Canadians in a sort of a holistic approach to conservation in the LCC.
Yeah, that is one area that we're still working on. We have one Canadian entity. We have the Ontario provincial government participating with us on our steering committee, and they also participate in our forest conservation effort. But we have not had a lot of success in working across the Canadian border yet. We're trying to improve upon that. There are lots of areas where in the Great Lakes region we work together already. We have the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is work between the U.S. and Canada, and that's where a lot of our Canadian entities would like to focus. But as we're starting to do our work in the LCC, that people are realizing connects to those efforts in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, we're starting to see a little more interest from our potential Canadian participants in our efforts. So it's an ongoing process. It's a place where we know we need to improve, and we're going to keep working at that.
Thanks, Brad. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been a great presentation, Brad. Thank you again, and great questions and discussion from folks. I appreciate everybody engaging in the call today and taking time out, and especially those of you who asked some really, really good questions. So with that, one more chance. Any other questions for Brad before we sign off? All right, everyone. Thank you very much again for attending. Brad, thanks again for an outstanding presentation, and we will be in touch, folks. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Rick.